more and more in the last few years, I've started doing a fair amount of work about the Coen brothers. If you guys are interested, you will probably be sick of hearing me talk about this film 20 minutes from now, but I wrote a long piece on this film for a Canadian magazine called CinemaScope. I can send Teaz or the group the link if any of you guys want to read it, written in English. I'm writing a TV documentary about their work right now, and I'm also working on a long book project about them. So suffice it to say, they're very interesting to me. And while I don't think all their films are created equal, I think that all their films are equally interesting to talk about for different reasons, whether it's Blood Simple, which they made in 1984, or Inside Llewyn Davis, which they made in 2013. And last year, I taught a course at the Miles Nadal JCC, an 8-week course about the Coens, where I talked about all of their films in detail. That would be very boring for you guys tonight, and I couldn't do that in 20 minutes. And I was trying to think of how I would talk about this movie, because there is so much that I want to say about how it connects to their other films and just about what they are and what they do as filmmakers. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, enjoying this, appreciating this. So how do I boil it down? And luckily, your group has a really strong theme for this season, which is music. And the idea of using music as a way into Inside Llewyn Davis makes a lot of sense. In a way, it means that I can talk about everything in the movie, even though I'm talking about only one thing, about the soundtrack, about the songs, about the music, because the relationship between the music and what this movie is saying, what this movie is about, how this story is told, and about the character of Llewyn Davis, it's a very, very close connection. Now the Coens, how many of you have seen a couple of the Coen brothers films? Has anyone seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou with George Clooney? Has anyone seen Fargo? Has anyone seen my other personal favorite, The Big Lebowski? She's the best. If you ever want me to talk about The Big Lebowski, I won't just do it for free, I'll pay you.
Should be some smoking.
Yeah, exactly. The Coens have always used music in a very specific and in a very clever way, most particularly in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which, if you've seen it, used folk music and bluegrass music to help tell the story of 3 convicts running through the Midwest in America during the Great Depression. That's what that movie is about, and it's told as a kind of musical from beginning to end. There's 20 songs in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, performed in their entirety over the course of the film. And in that film, the idea was to juxtapose Greek mythology, the narrative of Homer's Odyssey, which they claimed they based the screenplay on. They said they based their script on the Odyssey even though they'd never read the Odyssey, which is funny in and of itself. They wanted to juxtapose Greek mythology with American mythology, and the mythology of American music, the mythology of America expressed through these different songs and lyrics. We would kind of call them indigenous. And talking about what is indigenous in the United States is complicated and difficult. We're not talking about indigenous meaning First Nations, we're not talking about indigenous meaning Native American, but we're talking about songs and song forms that didn't seem to come from Europe, didn't seem to come from the old world, but that kind of sprouted up in the United States at different points in their history. And these melodies and these lyrics have shaped aspects of America's cultural identity. And what this gentleman was saying about the American dream and poverty and money is absolutely correct. That is a recurring theme of a lot of the songs and lyrics in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's a movie set during the Great Depression. In Inside Llewyn Davis, the kind of music, not the exact same songs, but the kind of music and the kind of performances that you see in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, set in 1933, are still being done, but in a very different context, in a different part of America. Now they're being done professionally in New York. And the sort of songs that came up out of the ground naturally in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou were people who were not musicians by trade, people who were not being paid to sing, still sang and sang all the time. Now this is a career that people are choosing. This is an entire movie set within a musical industry, an industry of folk music. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a movie about characters, escaped convicts, criminals, who pretend to be folk singers and become giant stars while they fake being folk singers. Inside Llewyn Davis is about a guy who wants to be a successful folk singer as a career and ends up failing. Although one of the things I think we're going to talk about, maybe in our conversation, is whether we think Llewyn Davis is a failure, and what we think his failure means, and what kind of failure he has at the end of the movie. I think that that's a very complicated question of whether he succeeds or fails by the end. I would say that on the whole, Inside Llewyn Davis is one of the most complex movies the Coens have ever made, and that's really saying a lot because they're scarily smart people, especially when it comes to their scripts. Their scripts are so dense, and I think this is one of their densest scripts. It's a period piece that is absolutely, as I think you were saying, filled with cultural references and historical references to Greenwich Village as a neighborhood in New York in the early 60s, and the different movements that were going on in American culture in the early 60s, the peace movement, the anti-war movement. There's rock and roll has started. You have the soldier played by Stark Sands talks about Elvis Presley, have I met Private Presley, and all that. It's about Greenwich Village's community of artists and musicians. This is a movie about male vanity and stubbornness, absolutely. You could do a whole lecture on what this movie says about men, the way that they treat women, the absence of Llewyn's mother, you could do a whole lecture on. You could talk about the mythological aspects and the literary aspects. The gentleman who pointed out the similarity to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is correct. The cat is named Ulysses, which is also the name of George Clooney's character in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou. In both cases, it's a joke on Homer's Odyssey and also on James Joyce's novel Ulysses, which was already a kind of Irish version of the Odyssey, or Irish interpretation of Greek mythology. And it also has some of the same themes about artistic integrity that you see in a movie like Barton Fink, which is actually the movie by the Coens that I think this is a lot like. I teach the two movies together. Barton Fink is about a screenwriter who goes to Hollywood and doesn't want to sell out and ends up sort of really, really getting his ass kicked by Hollywood. And Llewyn Davis is sort of the same story, except instead of Hollywood, it's about folk music. You could talk about all these aspects. I could talk about them all at once. We could talk about them one after the other, but that would be a very long lecture. And given the limited time frame here, I want to say how all the things that I just mentioned can be collapsed into a discussion of music. The songs in the film are connected to, and I think in some cases they help create this film's shape, this film's meaning, this film's subtext. They are certainly a source of its beauty and its pleasure and its emotion if you like this kind of music. If you don't, it's very boring. I have one friend who wrote a review of the film in the United States where he said the single biggest problem with this movie is that the songs are all performed in their entirety. I think it's the best thing about the movie, that the songs are performed in their entirety, because the music steps in for some of the drama that the plot doesn't provide, because this is a kind of aimless movie. And while the Coens are very, very smart, they like to act dumb. For instance, at Cannes, someone said, "Why is there a cat in the movie?" They said, "The movie's boring, we put a cat in there." They're willing to make that kind of joke about their own work, even though every element of their movies are very carefully chosen. And the songs in this movie are a great example of that. So what I've chosen is 6 songs that are on the soundtrack for this movie, a soundtrack that I listen to a lot when I'm working or when I'm traveling. It's very affordable on iTunes, or you can download it illegally. It's a beautiful soundtrack, even though it didn't sell as well as the soundtrack for Oh Brother, Where Art Thou. I'm going to speak very, very briefly about each song. And in doing so, I want to demonstrate how the music in Inside Llewyn Davis works, why it's important, beyond the fact of whether these songs are appropriate to the period or in an old-fashioned style. I think that if this film is a masterpiece, I would agree with what you said that it is, it's mostly a masterpiece of musical curation. Or rather, if you had the same actors, the same cinematographer, the same story, the same everything, and the songs were curated differently, I don't know what you would have, but you certainly wouldn't have this perfectly integrated film. So the first song that I'm going to talk about is the first song we hear in the movie, which is Hang Me, Oh Hang Me, which we hear played at the very beginning of the film. None of the songs in Inside Llewyn Davis, except for one, are original songs. I mean, everything is ultimately an original something. Someone wrote it for the first time. But what I mean to say is when Lewis is singing Hang Me, Oh Hang Me, it's not his original composition. Hang Me, Oh Hang Me is a traditional song. By the way, I'm not remotely a musicologist. I'm a film critic. I had to do research for this. If anyone corrects me on any of these points, because they know more, please do. But this is sort of what I've read about in reading about this film. They're what are called traditional songs, which is to say that their origin is too old and vague and collective to assign any credit. No one knows who wrote them. Llewyn says in the very first scene, and in the very last scene, because they're the same scene, if it was never new and it never gets old, it's a folk song. That's Lewis's line, and he gets a laugh from the audience. He's saying that this is music without an author, that this is music that instead has a series of interpreters over the years. And this is a very important point, and I'm going to return to this point of author versus interpreter at the end of my lecture. The Coens like to begin and end movies on the same point, and I'm going to do the same thing with my lecture. I'm going to begin with the idea of author and interpreter and end with the idea of author and interpreter at the same time. The Coens actually love circles in general. They're obsessed with circles. If you've seen Barton Fink or Burn After Reading or The Hudsucker Proxy, which is literally about a hula hoop, you know that they love circles and they love stories that begin and end sort of at the same point. And this is true of Llewyn Davis, which begins and ends in the same moment, with Llewyn on stage at the Gaslight singing, "Hang Me, Oh Hang Me." This is a song that has been performed by a variety of artists over the years, including starting in the 1940s in terms of recordings. It was actually covered by the Grateful Dead, and it was sung very famously by a guy named Dave Van Ronk, who, if any of you know about American folk music, was a major figure in Greenwich Village in the early 60s and is basically the inspiration for Llewyn Davis. Llewyn Davis is not about Dave Van Ronk, but Dave Van Ronk is a guy who served as the model for this character. The song "Hang Me" is sung from the point of view of a guy who is about to be executed. And the lyrics are about all the adventures and all the things that happen to him as he's leading up to his arrival at the gallows. And it's about his willingness at the end of this journey to die. The title of the song is not "Please Don't Hang Me." The title of the song is "Hang Me." He says he's okay with this at this point. The implication is maybe that he deserves what's about to happen to him. The implication is maybe that death is preferable to the rambling life that he's leaving behind. The lyrics are someone who's making peace with what's happened to him. It's a grim song, and Llewyn sings it with passion and with commitment. But the first time I saw the film, and I don't know if any of you felt the same way, when the movie started and he was singing it, did anyone think it seemed a little phony? Did anyone think that this is like over-singing or overdoing it a little bit in the very, very first scene? What I think about the first scene is that he is projecting a sadness that we might not think is there. That when we go see a musical performance, people are really interested in the idea of authenticity. Do they mean it, or are they kind of faking it? And the question of what this guy, who looks healthy and handsome and attractive and prosperous in New York in 1961, is doing, singing a song about wanting to die, we might think that that's a little phony. We might think that that's a little posturing. We might think that that is a little bit preposterous. The genius of Inside Llewyn Davis's structure is that when we come to that same song at the end, that same performance, shot a little differently, but it's the same performance, we can suddenly hear these lyrics as an echo of Llewyn's own experience, even though he didn't write them. Given what we've seen him go through, the idea of "hang me" is not a put-on, it's not fake, it's not phony, it's an expression of a weary soul. He goes through a lot over the course of this movie. And in the same way that the lyrics of "Hang Me" are about everything that leads up to the moment where the guy is going to be executed, the second time we see the performance, it's the same performance, we just know more about the character. All of a sudden the lyrics might mean a little more. It might seem like he owns them a little more. It might seem like it connects to his life a little bit more. The difference between these two renditions of "Hang Me," and they're not different, they're the same. They're just, one is placed at the beginning of the film and one is placed at the other of the film, but that's the structure. That's not a difference of performance. There's a gap between what we think of Llewyn at the beginning, which is that he's talented and he's good, but maybe a bit posturing and maybe a bit phony, and what we think about him at the end, where he really does seem like the hero of a folk song, a kind of rambling folk ballad who's been beaten down and lost and suffered and had bad things happen to him, and now boy does he want to be put out of his misery. That's the difference between him singing it the first time in the film and the difference between him singing it the second time. Note how stark this performance is. He sings it alone on stage with no accompaniment, just with his acoustic guitar. This is not just because it looks or sounds cool. This is not just because the Coens want a dramatic image. This is very important. One of the major points of this movie, to me it's just about the biggest point of Llewyn Davis's character, is that he's trying to be a solo artist, that he is trying to make it on his own. That is actually what shadows his every move in the film and influences his every decision. Most of them are bad decisions, is that he wants to be a solo star. The next few songs that I'm going to talk about quickly are all about his desire to go it alone, but they show the importance of collaboration in music making. They show why collaboration matters and why collaboration sometimes leads to better songs. The next song I want to talk about is "Fare Thee Well," which you hear 3 times in the movie, but most famously it's what's playing when he leaves the apartment at the beginning and takes the subway with the cat to go to Jean's house. That's the song that's playing on the soundtrack. This is a traditional ballad about a man saying goodbye to his loved one. It's about someone leaving his lover, leaving his girlfriend. If it's a man singing it, leaving a male partner. If it's a woman singing it, leaving somebody behind. It is crucially the only song in the movie that is not sung live. It's the only song in the movie that is not being performed by somebody on camera. It's being performed as a record. The needle drops on a record and we hear the song. And that's because the song was made before. This was a song that was sung and recorded by Llewyn and his partner, Mike Timlin, before Mike Timlin commits suicide. Mike's death hangs over Llewyn for the entire film. We never meet Mike. We see a picture of him for about 2 seconds, but he's a major character in this movie. We can say that Mike is kind of the structuring absence. Mike is what Llewyn Davis has lost. He finds thinking about Mike and thinking about the duo that they worked in together very painful. And it's painful because when you listen to the version of the song, there are these two voices joined in harmony. We hear Llewyn's voice and we hear Mike's voice. And the combination of these two voices, at least to me, is very, very beautiful. This is contrasted with the other 2 times we hear the song in the film. When Llewyn sings it at the Gorfine's apartment, Mrs. Gorfine tries to sing with her harp. She tries to sing Mike's part, and it makes Llewyn really angry and really upset. And whether he's angry because he misses Mike or because he just wants to sing by himself is up to us to decide. But either way, he doesn't want to be joined. And then at the end, he sings a solo version of the song in the club, and it sounds very different. It sounds angrier. It sounds sadder. All those beautiful notes are gone, and it's a very desperate performance, even though it's the same song. The lyrics of this song take on a very tragic dimension when you think about not a singer saying goodbye to his lover, but to Llewyn saying goodbye to his partner, a partner who has now left him and who is never going to come back because Mike is dead. The song plays over and over in the film, and every time it plays, you sort of feel like this is Llewyn is having to say goodbye to Mike, but he doesn't want to. It makes him angry to think about the fact that he's been abandoned. The title of this song is Fare Thee Well, and I want you to really think about the meaning of that title as I talk about the titles and lyrics of other songs in the movie, because every song in this movie has farewell in it. Every song in this movie either has farewell in its title, in its lyrics, or in its meaning. Not just 1 or 2 songs by coincidence, all of them are songs about saying goodbye, starting with Fare Thee Well. All the songs in this film are farewells of a sort, and the idea of goodbye is built into the script in other ways. I'll talk about a couple of those ways in a second. This is all tied into the idea of loss and separation, which seems to be Llewyn's greatest fear. This guy's clearly afraid of being alone, and yet paradoxically, he invites being alone because he's such an alienating jerk. He really doesn't let anybody get close to him. Of course he's going to end up alone when you talk to people that way, when you treat people that way, when you use people that way. And even though he's afraid of ending up alone, he wants to be a solo artist. And so the question of whether that's a self-fulfilling prophecy or not is something we can talk about in our discussion. For now, we can say that Fare Thee Well, as a song title, as a lyric, and as an idea, is perfect as the movie's theme song. It's tender, it's sad, and it's describing something elusive, something that seems to be escaping this character. This character is chasing something for this whole movie, and I don't think he ever quite catches it. And in that sense, this song is a perfect overture. So the next song I want to talk about is the song 100 Miles. Shortly after we meet Lewis, we see how nasty he is, Llewyn, we see how nasty he is to the other people in his circle. He's mean to them, but he keeps asking them for everything. Can I sleep on your couch? Can I borrow some money? I'm going to make myself breakfast. Can you help me out? He's a jerk, but he needs them in equal measure. One of these people is Jean, played by Carey Mulligan, who seems to be Llewyn's ex-girlfriend, seems to be sometimes his sexual partner, and the mother of his unborn child. This is where the whole discussion about her having an abortion comes in. The verbal abuse that she unleashes on Llewyn, she really reads him the riot act when they're walking together in the park. She's so mean to him. It seems to be on behalf of all the people he takes advantage of. The stuff that she tells him about himself fills in the backstory of how he seems to have treated everybody else in his life. And there isn't that much time to talk about Jean's character, but like a lot of the main figures here, she's also a singer. And the fact that she's a singer is not a coincidence, it's significant, and the musical number that she's given is also significant. She performs a lovely version of an old song, a song whose origin dates back to the 1800s, called 100 Miles. And she sings it with her friend Troy, that's the soldier who's a singer, and with her husband Jim, the guy played by Justin Timberlake. And this is an important scene. For one thing, like the recorded version of Fare Thee Well, this is all about the harmony of multiple voices. This is not someone sitting on stage alone. This is 3 people singing a song together, and it's really very beautiful. Llewyn is sitting alone, and watching. They're together singing, Llewyn is alone and watching. If you notice, everyone in the club starts singing along to the song. They sing along because they know it. If they were hearing an original song, they wouldn't sing along. It's a song that everybody knows, so they sing along. The only person who doesn't sing along is Llewyn. He can't fathom singing with other people. He can't put his voice into a group with other people. He sits quietly while everyone sings this beautiful song together. In this moment, I think Jean is so far away from Llewyn, even though she's just on stage a couple of feet from him. And that is what the song is about. The song is about being far away from someone you love, someone you miss, and that's how Jean appears to Llewyn at that point. She's a couple of feet away, but she might as well be 100 miles away while she's singing this song. And she's singing the kind of sweet, crowd-pleasing song that Llewyn would never sing and would never attempt and would never let himself be put in the position to perform. The song is about the distance between lovers, and the staging emphasizes that distance, literal and figurative distance between these characters. Note also, and this is an important point, this is a folk trio with 2 men and a woman. I don't know how many of you know Peter, Paul, and Mary, or have heard of Peter, Paul, and Mary, but that's a really, really famous American folk trio who were very successful, even though they were seen as being inauthentic. And that is exactly what Bud Grossman, the music producer, proposes to Llewyn a little later on. I'm going to talk about that song in a second, but he says, I want to put you in part of a folk trio, 2 guys and a girl. Llewyn has a vision of what the industry wants for him here, and he wants no part of it. And whether that is something he should be proud of or something that makes him really stupid is something that we can sort of take up afterwards. So then my favorite song in the movie, which is Please Mr. Kennedy, which is the very funny, very silly song that's performed at the CBS record office. Llewyn does a stint as a session musician. He's been invited there by Jim. This is ironic that Jim is trying to help Llewyn out because Lewis is sleeping with Jim's wife. And the reason Llewyn needs money is to pay for Jim's wife's abortion. Jim doesn't know this, and he says, let me help you out. I think Justin Timberlake's very funny in this movie. The scene might seem like a digression. It might seem like it comes out of nowhere, but it's another song about farewell. That's what the song is about. It's about an astronaut who is about to go on a journey, an astronaut who is leaving. The joke is that he's a coward, and he doesn't want to go to outer space. You would think a song about an astronaut going into space would be glorious and exciting and all of that, but it's not. He's a complete coward. He wants no part of this mission. And this is very funny for a lot of reasons. The Coens know so much about American history and American culture. They are not oblivious to the fact that in the 60s, the space race as a competition between America and Russia, between capitalism and communism, was a major issue. And astronauts were seen as heroes, and the space race was identified with Kennedy and with the best and most optimistic aspects of American life. So the idea of a cowardly astronaut is a little bit subversive. It's a bit like a soldier who doesn't want to go to war. Right? I mean, if you're an astronaut who doesn't want to be sent into space and you're begging the president for a reprieve, you are not a heroic figure at all. It seems to also express a little bit of fear of technology and progress, fear of outer space, fear of the technology it takes to get there. And that's a big thing for the Coens. If you've seen the Hudsucker Proxy, if you've seen The Man Who Wasn't There, they always make movies about how scary the future is. And I just saw the trailer for their new film, Hail Caesar, in which the villains call themselves the future. So the Coens are always making movies about people in the present tense who are afraid of the future, and that seems to be what that song is about. What else can we say about this song? It's about harmony. It's about 3 guitars and 3 voices bouncing off of each other in ways that are really funny and really catchy. Please Mr. Kennedy is a real song, sort of. About 2 of those verses are real, and the Coens wrote a whole bunch of other verses with the producer T-Bone Burnett and did an original arrangement. But this is the kind of crummy pop novelty song that existed all the time in the 1960s, so they're not inventing anything. This is basically factually true. Now, Llewyn thinks the song is stupid. His contempt is evident before, during, and after the performance. And maybe it is stupid. But it's also catchy, it's also fun, it sounds like a hit, and in one of the Coens' many, many ironies at the end of the film, it is a hit. We hear that the song was a gigantic big hit, which should be good for Llewyn. He wants to be a successful pop singer, a folk singer, he wants to be paid for making folk music. This is a victory for him, right? No, it's not. He asks to be paid as an independent contractor. Note the word independent. He doesn't want to be paid as a session musician. He doesn't want to be paid like he was part of something. He wants to be paid like he's apart from something. This is short-sighted. He is cheating himself out of future royalties. He is cheating himself out of the kind of money he should get for being part of this hit. This connects to his pride and arrogance and his unwillingness to be part of a trio. This could have been a good thing for him, but he just takes the quick $200 to fix his other mistake, to try and get this money to abort Jean's baby. What he really wants, though, is to be a star. And he thinks, and maybe we think, that he would be a big star if only someone would give him a chance. Which brings us to my favorite scene in the film, just about my favorite scene in any of the Coen brothers movies, which is the scene where he performs The Death of Queen Jane. This is the scene with F. Murray Abraham as Bud Grossman, the concert promoter. And what a complicated scene this is to watch and think and talk about, at least for me. Llewyn gets the chance to try and be a star at a club that is called the Gate of Horn. I don't know if any of you have read the Iliad, but this is another reference to the Odyssey. The Coens cannot help themselves. In the Odyssey, in the original Greek, the Gate of Horn is a place where heroes are tested. So they make references to the Odyssey in this film by calling the cat Ulysses, and they make a reference to the Odyssey in this film by having the club where Llewyn is going to be judged be called the Gate of Horn, which is where heroes in the Iliad are judged as well. And the judge is a guy named Bud Grossman. The jokes just don't stop, because Bud Grossman is a joke on the name of Al Grossman. Does anyone know who Al Grossman was? Anyone?
Bob Dylan's producer.
Yeah, Al Grossman was Bob Dylan's producer and manager. So in the name of this character, they're making a very funny joke about Bob Dylan. Al Grossman is supposedly the guy who made Bob Dylan. And so Lou Grossman could be the guy who makes Llewyn Davis, right? In a way, this is the climax of the film, even though it happens long before the end. A lot of people say that Llewyn Davis loses steam after this scene and becomes repetitive. That's actually not wrong. I think that everything after this is a kind of a descending action. This is the most important scene in the movie, or one of the most important scenes in the movie by far. It's Llewyn's big chance. So Bud says, and I love the line, he says, "Play me something from inside Llewyn Davis." And this is a double entendre. Inside Llewyn Davis is the name of his album, but it also means he wants him to do something personal. And we're going to have to ask ourselves now, what is inside this guy? What is he going to sing? Because he's really an asshole, and he's really not nice, and he's really not friendly, and he seems so unbelievably unable to help himself. So what is he going to sing in this moment? So he chooses an obscure, repetitive 17th century ballad called The Death of Queen Jane, which is about the death and childbirth of one of Henry VIII's wives. That's what that song is about. The lyrics are about this woman dying and calling her handmaidens to her side and saying, "Tear the baby out of me before I die." And then Henry saying, "We can't do that. I don't want you to die. I don't want to lose both of you." And then in the end, Queen Jane dies. That's what the lyrics of the song are. And he plays the whole song for Bud Grossman. He tells the whole story when he's playing that song. This is a very old-fashioned piece of music. It is arcane, it has formal lyrics, it's sad, it's solemn. I find it very moving, and within the world of the film, it's a terrible choice. It's an absolutely terrible choice from one point of view. What does Bud say immediately after the song is over? He says, "I don't see any money here." And that's both the first thing he says, and it's the last word on Llewyn's choice, because what else is there to say after that? This gentleman was talking about the collision between commerciality and artistic integrity. It's exactly what this scene is about, but in a complicated way. Bud, we can think, we imagine Bud Grossman is thinking of something more like, oh, I don't know, Troy, who sings the song Last Thing on My Mind, the army guy, where he's thinking of the trio singing 100 Miles, or maybe he's actually thinking of something like Please Mr. Kennedy. He's thinking of something that's going to make some money. Pleasing songs made by a group instead of stripped down solo performance with Llewyn Davis there singing his heart out with his acoustic guitar. He doesn't see any money in that. He isn't thinking about art, he's thinking about commerce. He tells Llewyn that he isn't bad, but also that Llewyn isn't great. We might actually agree with that Llewyn isn't bad, but that Llewyn isn't great, and in some ways that might just be the honest truth. But either way, as an audience, unless we really hate Llewyn, we're kind of disappointed by Bud's assessment. He says to Llewyn, "You should be part of a trio." Llewyn says no. He says to Llewyn, "You should get back together with your old partner," which he doesn't know is a horrible thing to say to Llewyn. But in both cases, Llewyn says, "I can't." You know, he's going to keep going it alone. He will not succeed on someone else's terms. So in this way, the choice of the death of Queen Jane is a big failure. It's the emblem of Llewyn's failure. But the Coens are so sophisticated that we can look at this scene in another way. That this scene is Llewyn's great triumph in some ways, or that this is the scene that truly humanizes him in a movie that otherwise makes him seem kind of like a very bad guy. He's asked to play something from inside, and so what does he choose? He chooses a song about a father who is agonizing about the life of his child, a child who he worries is going to die before that child is even born. A feeling that is very familiar to him since on this same day, this same trip, he's learned, one, that a child he thought had been aborted 2 years ago is still alive and he can maybe go see him, and two, that the girl carrying his child now wants to have an abortion. So the choice of a song about a baby who might die in childbirth really is something that comes from inside Llewyn Davis. He is doing what Mrs. Gorfine said, which is singing as an expression of the soul. He's singing because he feels this song and feels the lyrics of it, and that's why his performance, I think, is so remarkable. It's not commercial, but if we agree with the idea that art and music is an expression of the soul, this is definitely art. And so the failure is not Llewyn Davis's, the failure is Bud Grossman's, to recognize that, to value that, to do anything with that. If he can't see or hear the sincerity in Llewyn's performance, then Bud is the one who's wrong, not Llewyn Davis. When I interviewed Oscar Isaac about this movie, he told me something that was so brilliant I've never stopped thinking about it, which is the chord progression that he's playing underneath the death of Queen Jane. It's an original arrangement of the song. It's the same chord progression as in the Who's song, Baba O'Reilly, which is also called Teenage Wasteland, which is a big, famous rock anthem from the end of the 60s. And they did that on purpose, because Bud Grossman thinks he knows everything about the industry and about music, but he can't hear it. He can't hear that in the chords of this song, Llewyn is doing something that's actually going to be really popular a little bit later on, and suggesting that in this very old song, there's something of rock and roll's future. So now to conclude, while we talk about the future and the way the future shows up in this movie, we come to the last song I'm going to talk about, the last song of the movie, the thing that really happens at the end of the movie, and the thing that gives the movie its very ironic, very cruel, very interesting meaning. That is Bob Dylan at the end of the film, where it's an actor playing Bob Dylan, an actor briefly lip-syncing to an actual recording of Bob Dylan in the background of Llewyn's story. Sneaking on stage as Llewyn leaves to go get beaten up in an alley. So we sort of leave Llewyn where we found him at the beginning of the film. Now, a lot of critics interpreted this simply as a joke. The Coens are very sarcastic, they said, and this is their meanest joke ever, that this whole movie is about Llewyn Davis as the opening act for Bob Dylan. That this is just a guy who's a footnote to history, that on the night that Bob Dylan showed the world how great he was, Llewyn Davis was the opening act, and no one cares. And that's not untrue. I mean, to some extent, that's the way that the film is structured. But there's more to it, too. And the more of this is the thing I mentioned at the beginning between the difference between interpretation and authorship. Llewyn Davis does not write a single song in this movie. Llewyn Davis does not write a word or a lyric of his own. He's not a composer. I'm not saying that makes him bad, but he's not. He's an interpreter. Dylan is a composer. The song at the end of the film is the only original song in the entire movie. The movie ends with an original song, and it's not Llewyn Davis's, it's Bob Dylan's. Dylan has the ability, I would say a rare and unmatched ability in the history of popular American music, to evoke old musical forms, synthesize them together, and create something new in an original voice, because no one has a voice like Bob Dylan, literally or figuratively speaking, and that's who Bob Dylan is. Llewyn just inhabits other people's songs. He sings as other characters who he didn't come up with. He may identify with them, they may express something about him, but they do not belong to him. He belongs to them. And that's the difference between Llewyn Davis and Bob Dylan. Llewyn's limitation is very interesting. He remains true to himself in every aspect of his life, even the bad parts of his life that make his life worse. He remains true to himself and doesn't compromise. But he can't invent a more successful persona for himself. He can't invent it in life, and he can't invent it in art, because he can't write a song. He doesn't even try. He just sings other people's music. Dylan, meanwhile, is a great shapeshifter. He's a chameleon. He is someone who is 50 different people at once. They even made a whole movie about Bob Dylan called I'm Not There. And the point of that movie is that Dylan is played by 6 different actors over the course of that movie, because there is no one Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is a Jewish guy from suburban Minnesota, and yet he seems like this giant mythical American artist because he changed his name, because of the voice that he has. He doesn't seem like a human being almost to some people. He seems like a mythological figure. He's part of America's mythology. I believe, by way of concluding, that the Coens identify with both of these guys, and that this movie is kind of both about Llewyn Davis and Bob Dylan in different ways. They identify with Llewyn, who is a failure who fears of being alone. Think about the fact that they've made all their movies as a team. They've never worked for 1 second without each other. And then think about what it means to make a movie about a duo where one member dies and leaves the other person alone. And that, to me, is the Coens' personal stake in this material. And they identify with Dylan. The Coens are also Jews from suburban Minnesota. They are also guys who've taken every aspect of American culture. They've taken American tall tales, folklore, the Great Depression, gangsters, Greenwich Village, the Atomic Age, everything. The same way Bob Dylan takes stuff that exists, and they've synthesized it, and they've reconfigured it, and they've ripped it off, and they've stolen from it, and put it into an original voice. I mean, in a way, the Coens are maybe not quite to cinema what Bob Dylan is to music, but close enough. Right down to the fact that, as I said, suburban Jewish guys from Minnesota. To me, the ending of Inside Llewyn Davis is a way of saying goodbye to one character, which is Llewyn, and saying hello to another character, another figure, which is Bob Dylan. Goodbye to one and hello to another. But they're showing that both have their place in musical history. They're both worthy in different ways. Bob Dylan succeeds. We certainly don't need to say whether or not Bob Dylan has succeeded. He's succeeded beyond his or anybody else's wildest dreams. Llewyn Davis's success is a little more provisional and a little more self-defeating, but over the course of this entire movie, he does things his own way. And since that's what he really, really wants, can we really say that that's a failure? Is it a failure that's a kind of success, or a success that's a kind of failure? What's the last thing we see him do in the movie? He gets up after being knocked down. Chases his assailant off, or at least kind of watches him leave. He's very much a man defending his turf. He's very happy to see that this guy's leaving Greenwich Village, because Llewyn feels that Greenwich Village belongs to him. What are the last words in the film? Au revoir, which is French for goodbye. And then we hear the rest of the Bob Dylan song on the soundtrack at the end of this movie. Does anyone know what the name of the Bob Dylan song is?